Hello, Wayne Pop. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan from Illinois State University, and the title of the panel we're bringing to you today is Wild Histories and the Move Toward Narrative Pluralism, Popular Cultural Narratives as the Multi-Scale Embodiment of Identity in Supernatural, Black Panther, Halloween, and Black Lightning. Colleagues, please introduce yourselves.
So I'm Dr. Erik Wesselmann from Illinois State University as well, social psychologist, interested in all things nerdy, and I particularly like horror films.
Vanessa.
I am Dr. Vanessa Hintz, professor of psychology at Alverno College in Milwaukee. Also a licensed clinical psychologist, also someone who loves horror films, so I'm very excited to hear what Erik has to say.
Stanford.
I'm Dr. Stanford Carpenter. I am a cultural anthropologist coming to you out of Chicago, Illinois. I am also the co-creator and co-host of the forthcoming Brother Story and the Correspondent podcast.
Fantastic.
Carry on my wayward son. There'll be peace when you are done. Lay your weary head to rest. Don't you cry no more.
So, as I said, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan from Illinois State University, and the title of my talk is Wild Folklore, Driving Through Normal with Two Boys, an Old Drunk, and a Fallen Angel. Here's a clip from one of my favorite TV shows, Supernatural.
You okay?
Yes, I will be. It's just all the adventures I enjoy are usually of the literary nature.
Yeah, well, now that you're done blowing chunks, you want to tell us who Betty Crocker was?
Abaddon. She's a demon.
No kidding. Where'd she come from? Where'd you come from?
She's from hell. I'm from Normal, Illinois, 1958.
Yeah, right. Seriously? Dude's time traveling through motel room closets, that's what we've come to?
If you could just take me to John, we could clear all this up, I'm sure.
I told you that's not gonna happen.
And why not?
Because he's dead.
That scene is actually Sam and Dean's grandfather, who has come back into their time. And what I love about that scene is when Dean asks, who are you? And he says, oh, hey, I'm from Normal, Illinois, 1958. The brothers are shocked by that phrase. They're not shocked by the phrase, she's a demon, she's from hell. And what I love about it is, on the one hand, that's the phrase that's abnormal for us. I'm from Normal, Illinois, 1958 is the phrase that's normal for us, not the one about the demon. So the point is, this scene reminds us that like Sam and Dean Winchester and their time-traveling grandfather, we're all from Normal, right? But we're not geographically from Normal. We're developmentally from Normal. We all grew up in a context around people who held certain beliefs, lived in certain spaces, and those spaces, those beliefs become what we expect out of the world, and that becomes our normal. So what I first want to talk about is what Supernatural examines this idea of navigating different normals. So I want to start with another clip here. Notice that
Now I know what these are. Road rash. And I'm guessing Luther swallowed some wood chips when he was being dragged down that road.
Makes sense. You're experiencing his death in slow motion.
Yeah, well, not slow enough, huh? Let's say we burn some bones and get me healthy.
Dean, it won't be that easy.
No, it'll be that easy. Why won't it be that easy?
Luther was road hauled. His body was ripped to pieces. He was probably scattered all over that road. There's no way we're gonna find all the remains.
You're kidding me.
Look, we'll just have to figure something else out.
You know what? Screw this.
Whoa, Dean, come on.
I mean, Sam, what are we doing?
We're hunting a ghost.
A ghost, exactly. Who does that?
Us.
Us. Right. And that is exactly why our lives suck. I mean, come on. We hunt monsters. What the hell? I mean, normal people, they see a monster and they run, but not us. No. We search out things that want to kill us. Yeah? Huh? Or eat us. You know who does that? Crazy people. We are insane.
So what I love about that scene is it reveals how much the two Winchester brothers navigate two different types of normals and actually live in both of these normals at the same time. So what they'll often do is dress in FBI outfits and act in FBI tropes so that they can deal with normal culture, so that they can get the data they need to go back out and save the world from monsters, right? And they're both of their identities are fully aware that they're navigating these different normals. Data indicates, for example, that people from underrepresented groups often engage in what's called code switching. And this code switching is indicative of an awareness of existing in at least two different codes of normal. But aren't all main streets really the same? In other words, even though we all come from a different context and therefore one might think we're rather different, it turns out that most of these normals are actually quite the same.
Sam?
Yeah.
Clock me one.
What?
Come on. Come on, I won't even hit you back. Let's go.
No.
Let's go. You get a freebie. Hit me. Come on.
You look like you just went 12 rounds with a block of cement, Dean. I'll take a rain check.
Wish we never took this job. It's jacked everything up.
What do you mean?
Think about all the hunts we went on, Sammy, our whole lives.
Okay.
What if we killed things that didn't deserve killing? You know? I mean, the way Dad raised us.
Dean, after what happened to Mom, Dad did the best he could.
I know he did. But the man wasn't perfect. And the way he raised us to hate those things, and man, I hate them. I do. When I killed that vampire at the mill, I didn't even think about it. Hell, I even enjoyed it.
You didn't kill Lenore.
No, but every instinct told me to. I was gonna kill her. I was gonna kill them all.
Yeah.
So what we see here is Dean's awareness that the normative tension he lives in is actually something that he thinks he should be questioning, right? So in the first clip, we saw them expressing the tension of living in two normative systems. And now we see him basically saying, yeah, but all these things we kill, maybe that's just because of the way our dad raised us, right? And then you can see the other brother trying to help him with that normative tension, trying to keep their narratives coherent, I'd argue. But what this shows us is that all systems of normality are the same in that they emerge developmentally out of one's unique past, right? As recently as 1972, the American Psychiatric Association considered homosexuality a treatable mental disorder. In 1973, scientific research in social activism forced homosexuality to be defined as a normal variant on human sexuality. Because of this change in normal, today's youths tend to not even consider attraction to the same-sex person as abnormal. As a matter of fact, they actually avoid terms like gay and lesbian because their own norms don't define sexual preference as an extremely important part of their personal identity. Therefore, nothing is ever normal because it's supposed to be. But why does it feel that way, right? Why does it feel like something's truly wrong when it violates our expectations? And the reason is because the brain is a hope-filled cage. And what I want to show you right now is why the brain is a hope-filled cage. And I'll start with this clip.
Right. And why would an angel rescue me from hell?
Good things do happen, Dean.
Not in my experience.
What's the matter? You don't think you deserve to be saved?
Why'd you do it?
So it's in that very phrase, not in my experience, where Dean is testifying to the fact that his expectations about the world come from the life that he's lived. What I quickly want to show in this image is simply that the cortex of your brain is continuously sending information to your spinal cord to make your body move. And that produces effects in the world that come back to your brain. It's just a simple feedback loop. What I want to show you today is that these neural signals from your cortex to your spinal cord also go to what I'll call the neural recorder, the cerebellum. And those neurons in the cerebellum receive the feedback as well. So what you've got going on in the cerebellum is actually a recorder of what you intended to do and what happened. And the reason that matters is because later on, when you intend to do something, you actually activate your memories of how you did it before. And those memories are able to prime your planning faster than the speed of feedback. In other words, Jimi Hendrix can play 32 notes a second because the second he starts to plan the first two movements, his brain is priming him for the next 20. And this all happens unconsciously. Every aspect of your cortex, your perceiving, your thinking, your acting brain is infiltrated by this neural recorder. So every time you act, perceive, or think, what you're doing, seeing, or thinking about is being primed by the way you've acted, seen, and thought before. And you don't even know about it until you're surprised. This then renders anticipation necessary, but also occurs. So how do we escape the cage? And we do so by telling a new story, all right? So here we have
Supernatural, scene 36, take 1. Marker.
Action!
So what's happening here is that Sam and Dean have been transported to another dimension in which they're playing themselves in the TV show Supernatural, right? So they're basically recursing.
Balthazar is no hero, but he knows Raphael will never take him back. Supernatural, scene 36, take 8.
What we're getting there is that Supernatural then is metafiction, fiction that makes reference to its status as fiction to surprise a reader or viewer and invite them to ask questions about the nature of stories and the context they reference. And here's the point, metafiction produces surprise. Surprise is a violation of normal. Surprise provokes conscious awareness. Some cognitive scientists argue that the purpose of consciousness is to make the entire brain available to solve a violation of unconscious assumptions in one of our conscious norms. So when you're walking down the stairs talking to your friend and you suddenly find yourself falling because you unconsciously anticipated you were at the bottom, but you weren't even aware of your feet. And all of a sudden you become completely consciously aware of your feet and you throw everything into solving that problem. In those moments of being consciously awoke, we escape the cage of anticipation of our unconscious assumptions, and we're better able to intentionally simulate possibilities that unconscious assumptions do not consider. Armed with these conscious intentions, we can then do the work of consciously changing the world so that we and others can develop new, more adaptive normals. But never forget, intentional change will never work until it becomes a new unconscious normal. As I said, the brain's a hope-filled cage. So what this does is Supernatural for me represents a sort of what I'll call wild folklore. By frequently engaging in metafiction, Supernatural continually breaks free from its own cage and creates a new kind of folklore for contemporary America. It's not a folklore about good and evil, right and wrong, or in-groups and out-groups. It's a wild folklore, a folklore that recognizes the past-driven nature, the contextual nature of all normative systems. It's a wild folklore that admonishes us to be ever vigilant of the cages we necessarily create for ourselves in order to be someone and get through the day. The point there is you can't be someone without these unconscious assumptions. What we can do is become woke from them and work to change the world so that we develop different cages. Here's a final clip.
How's your head?
I think the slammers pretty much wore off. And between them and 20 cups of coffee, I'm nicely tense and alarmed.
I wasn't talking about that.
No, Bobby, don't go all Sigmund Freud on me right now, okay? I just got drugged by a sandwich.
I want to talk about your new party line.
Party line? What are you talking about? I don't even vote.
The world's a suicide case. We save it. It just steals more pills.
Bobby, I'm here, okay? I'm on the case. What's the problem?
I've seen a lot of hunters live and die. You're starting to talk like one of the dead ones, Dean.
No, I'm talking the way a person talks. When they've had it. When they can't figure out why they used to think all this mattered.
Oh, you poor sorry. You're not a person.
Thanks.
Come on now. You tried to hang it up and be a person with Lisa and Ben. And now here you are with a mean old coot and a van full of guns. That ain't person behavior, son. You're a hunter, meaning you're whatever the job you're doing today. Now, you get a case of the Ann Sexton, something's gonna come up behind you and rip your fool head off.
Coming from a broken down old drunk, that's pretty sound advice for two brothers and a fallen angel who are trying to figure out their own cages while driving from normal to normal, helping others deal with the traumas they find in theirs. Thanks. The ideas presented in this talk can also be found in a book chapter by the same name. The title of the book is Supernatural Psychology, Roads Less Traveled.
Do you think that like the concept of normality is inescapable? Like we always have to have a normal, or can we ever be without normal?
I would argue normal is what living systems generate. Because living systems have to do work to generate some kind of stability.
Okay.
And just as a single cell has to do work to keep its cell membrane, its border with the world constantly there. If it doesn't do that, it can't be a cell. And for me, that's what identity is, in the world, doing the work to be someone. And if I don't have those unconscious assumptions that create my normal, I'm not someone. And sci-fi and fantasy and horror are all full of deconstructions of someone's assumptions, either in their head or in the world. And then we look at what falls apart and how they try to bring it together. And what they're trying to do is either get back to some old normal or try to create some kind of new normal. But in the end, it's all, I would argue, necessary to be someone. Reality can go wherever it goes, right? But like fish in the ocean, we got to work, we got to swim. Otherwise, we can't be a fish.
And I think it's interesting too what you're saying, because I think that just to take that one step further in terms of, like you mentioned, identity. I think when people have identity issues, quote unquote, it comes from a valuation of their normal. So like, this normal I am today is less than yesterday or is greater than. And so I think a lot of times when people experience like self-esteem issues that are tied to identity, it's because of not the change in expectations, but the valuing of not expectations, of normal. Like, it's not the change in whatever your normal is, it's the valuation of it. And I think sometimes in therapy that comes up a lot because, do whatever you want, do you, be free. Like, but I think where the issue comes in is, again, where we value things differently. So like, I'm devalued if I'm a size 12, but I'm valued if I'm a size 2. You know what I'm saying?
I get it. No. I think in that scene where Dean and Sam are in their FBI outfits and Dean says, dude, like, we chase ghosts. That's crazy. I mean, that's just a metaphor for people saying, I'm gay and my family won't tolerate it, and then eventually you get to the point where, well, maybe they're the problem, right? And that tension between these constellation of forces in our lives, managing that constellation of forces is identity. And people who are fortunate enough to have all that in line, good for them. But I don't tend to be one of those people. But yeah, that tension is definitely a lot of the psychic anguish comes from that tension.
Would it be fair then to say that normal, we are oriented towards finding maybe it'd be a new normal, right? That phrase is often used. that what we might call the normal that we're striving for is a coherent sense of identity, and one that's not being violated. It's positive.
Make
Like,
America great again.
Well,
right. That's all about keeping an old identity.
Well, that's about more than keeping an old identity. That's also about what I think is interesting is that it's also about the conflict that gets generated, not just on an individual scale, but on a mass scale when you have different kinds of normals bumping up against each other.
Yes.
Like the one thing that's interesting about the clip that you brought up, where he's talking about, well, we're killing ghosts, right? Is that and I would have liked to have seen a little more discussion about what normal is to the ghost. And I think that's kind of the next step, right? Is is starting to look at how these different notions of normal are asserted, and how some are allowed to coexist and some are not.
Well, I would say that empathy is what Dean ultimately expresses, taking the ghost's perspective, basically allowing the live life of the ghost into Dean's experiences. We all do that every day when we look at someone and either choose to take on their suffering or not. To be honest, like we're seeing in Lovecraft Country and in HBO's Watchmen, we're seeing counter forces in media about whose trauma are we going to talk about? Whose norm are we going to entertain? And so it's, for me, that struggle never ends. It never ends in the individual, and it never ends in the group. And I think that's one of the things I love about Supernatural, is that it teaches us that reality is metafiction. There is no point where we get it right. There is no point where there's the final good normal. Life is work, and managing that. And so if that's what it is, then what can we do to make it quote unquote better? What we can do is work to create a norm that's aware we all live in norms. In other words, it's a recursive metafictional norm where we recognize difference, celebrate it, and then respect ourselves for respecting difference. That's all got to come together. And that's the work I see. That's the work I see myself wanting to do in the future.
Again, my name is Dr. Vanessa Hintz. I am a licensed clinical psychologist by day, and by night, I guess. But a lot of the work I do in my practice, in my therapy practice, is I specifically work with people of color who want a therapist of color. So a lot of the work that I do clinically is related to race, racism, minority identity, as well as the research that I do. And like the professional trainings that I do, I'm also a diversity consultant. So a lot of the work that I do professionally is related to issues of oppression, social justice. So I'm going to talk about all of that in the context of the Black Panther film. I'm going to talk a little bit about Black Panther in the comics, maybe, I don't know. But a lot of it is based on the representation in the film. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about minority identity development and use the characters of T'Challa, King T'Challa, aka Black Panther, and Erik Killmonger. So before we do so, I would be remiss if I did not just pay homage to Chadwick Boseman, who we lost very recently, who played the character of Black Panther in the film and many other Marvel films, and he just portrayed a number of influential Black people in his work, and he was amazing. So just to pay homage to him. So then moving forward, I'm going to sort of set the stage a little bit to talk about, just to set the stage with the characters. So talk a little bit about Wakanda just as an entity, as its own character in the story, and then talk a little bit about each of the characters individually, and then we'll sort of tie all that into minority identity development and also race relations and oppression. So just to start off, this is the opening scene from the movie Black Panther, and if you haven't seen it, just get your life and see it soon. But this is the opening scene where we sort of get introduced to Wakanda, and Wakanda as a place, and then sort of the people of Wakanda. So this is the first clip we will watch together.
Baba?
Yes, my son.
Tell me a story.
Which one?
The story of home.
Millions of years ago, a meteorite made of vibranium, the strongest substance in the universe, struck the continent of Africa, affecting the plant life around it. And when the time of men came, 5 tribes settled on it and called it Wakanda. The tribes lived in constant war with each other until a warrior shaman received a vision from the Panther goddess bust, who led him to the heart-shaped herb, a plant that granted him superhuman strength, speed, and instincts. The warrior became king, and the first Black Panther, the protector of Wakanda. 4 tribes agreed to live under the king's rule, but the Jabari tribe isolated themselves in the mountains. The Wakandans used vibranium to develop technology more advanced than any other nation. But as Wakanda thrived, the world around it descended further into chaos. To keep vibranium safe, the Wakandans vowed to hide in plain sight, keeping the truth of their power from the outside world.
Okay. So that was just a sort of precursor to Wakanda, which again is like its own centralized character in the Black Panther film. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit for anybody who's unfamiliar. I know none of us are unfamiliar, but for anybody who's unfamiliar with the characters of T'Challa and Erik Killmonger. So T'Challa is the eldest child of King T'Chaka, who we see is killed, and Queen Ramonda, who is played by Angela Bassett in the film beautifully. And as we saw in that opening clip, Wakanda is its own sovereign nation, ruled by a monarch, and is technologically advanced because of vibranium. The entire technological program, I guess technological advancements of Wakanda are overseen by Princess Shuri, who is T'Challa's younger sister. And we first see T'Challa in the MCU in Captain America Civil War after his father is killed in an explosion, and he goes on this like revenge quest. And it just has one of the most amazing introductions to the MCU that I've ever seen. I'm biased, but essentially T'Challa has trained his entire life to take the mantle of Black Panther and to serve as king. So from a very young age, this is how he was sort of developed. This is how he was reared in childhood. Like all the experiences that he had growing up were under the assumption that one day he would take over, not only just as king, but as the protector of Wakanda and as Black Panther. So again, to juxtapose that with Erik Killmonger, who was played by the amazing Michael B. Jordan. So again, this is the sort of iteration and origin story from the movie, a little bit different in the comics, but in the movie, so Erik Killmonger is a Wakandan. That he is Wakandan because of his father is Wakandan, but he was, I think in the movie, he was born in America to the prince of a Wakandan prince and an American woman. And in the movie, we see that Killmonger's father is killed by King T'Chaka, just in this like whole dramatic family situation. And Erik actually discovers his father's body, doesn't know what happened, but then he learns what happened. It's like a whole thing. So he too goes on a revenge quest. He is like super smart, like super crazy spy, assassin person. Graduated from MIT, graduated from the Naval Academy. He's a Navy SEAL. He's just like, is just everything in everything. And so he is, like I said, seeking revenge for his father's death. And we see in the film that Killmonger knows his entire life that his father was killed by the Black Panther. So he just like hatches this whole plot. Like, I'm just going to overthrow everything and I'm just going to mess it all up. So those are the two characters, like I said, that we're going to sort of talk about in juxtaposition as it relates to minority identity development. But before we get to that specifically, I think this is one of my favorite clips from the entire film, from the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, because it really does a good job of putting these two characters side by side, and you sort of hear their differences of opinion, their differences in message. You hear it all very clearly in this clip. So we will go ahead and watch that.
Is this man Wakandan or not?
Teta, speak. I'm standing in your house, serving justice to a man who stole your vibranium and murdered your people. Justice your king couldn't deliver.
I don't care that you brought Claw. Only reason I don't kill you where you stand is because I know who you are. Now what do you want?
I want the throne.
Hey, you, the tuna.
Y'all sitting up here comfortable. Must feel good. It's about 2 billion people all over the world that looks like us, but their lives are a lot harder. Wakanda has the tools to liberate them all.
And what tools are those?
Vibranium. Your weapons.
Our weapons will not be used to wage war on the world. It is not our way to be judge, jury, and executioner for people who are not our own.
Not your own. But didn't life start right here on this continent? So ain't all people your people?
I am not king of all people. I am king of Wakanda. And it is my responsibility to make sure our people are safe and that vibranium does not fall into the hands of a person like you.
Son, we have entertained the charlatan for too long. Reject his request.
Oh, I ain't requesting nothing. Ask who I am.
You're Erik Stevens, an American black operative, a mercenary nicknamed Killmonger. That's who you are.
That's not my name, princess. Ask me, king.
No.
Ask me.
Take him away.
Ungubani, Indingu Njadaka, Unyanaka Njobu.
Huh? Unyanaka Njobu?
I found my daddy with Panther claws in his chest. You ain't the son of a king, you are the son of a murderer.
Son. Lies!
I'm afraid not, Queen Mother.
What? You Indanda Tokan Njobu.
Hey, Auntie. I'm exercising my blood right. The challenge for the mantles of King and Black Panther.
Do not do this, T'Challa.
As the son of Prince Njobu, he is within his rights.
He has no rights here.
The challenge will take weeks to prepare.
Weeks? I don't need weeks. The whole country ain't gotta be there. I just need him and somebody to get me out of these chains.
T'Challa, what do you know of this?
I accept your challenge.
Okay, so in that clip, like I said, it's one of my favorites because even the way that they're sort of, like you see Michael B. Jordan and he's just very tense and angry and just, I don't want to say hostile, but hostile. And you see T'Challa is much more, you see, you know, he's more calm on the outside and very pensive. And you see the, like I said, the sort of comparison and juxtaposition between their two ideals. So Killmonger comes in and he says, you know, like, we got the tools, let's just liberate all Black people. And T'Challa is much more reserved. So we're going to talk about what that means in the context of minority identity development, which this model was first developed by Dr. Sue and others. And it really, it's a 5-stage model, and arguably it can be applied to anybody who has any sort of minority identity development. This is specifically with regard to racial minorities. So I know the chart is a little hard. It's weird the way it's not in order, but this conformity stage is the first stage that arguably people with minority identity status go through. And that conformity stage is essentially when you disavow your minority status and you sort of are fully thrown into majority culture, which in this case is white culture. So In America, like adopting American culture typically means adopting white culture. So in this instance, minority individuals often either they don't acknowledge that they have minority identity status, or they, like I said, are outwardly like, no, that is not me. I'm American and that's it. And so after the conformity stage, people often move into this dissonance stage, which is usually triggered by some sort of race-related event. So being discriminated against, being profiled, being, not allowed to join a particular group because of your race. Something like that pushes minority identified individuals into this dissonance stage, which is essentially like, hold up, maybe I am different, or, maybe things aren't the same for me. It's usually, again, triggered when you understand that you don't have the same privilege as others. So I would argue for Killmonger specifically, I don't know what he was like as a child, but I would argue that, him discovering his father and that whole traumatic event probably pushed him very quickly at a very young age into this stage where he no longer is just a child anymore. He's like, what is going on? Everything is different. So after this dissonance stage, individuals move into the resistance and immersion stage, which is essentially fully immersing yourself into your minority identity status, and that is it. So you sort of are very resistant to anything from the majority culture. So again, in this case, would be white culture. I always call it the pro-Black power stage, which is not a bad thing. It's more so like, I'm Black and that's it. People are very Afrocentric in this stage, which doesn't mean they're not Afrocentric at other stages, but I would argue that this is where Killmonger is fully cemented throughout the film. I would argue throughout his life. After seeing his father killed, you saw in that clip, we're about to liberate everyone, we're taking over the world, we have these weapons, like everybody else be damned, essentially. After that, arguably, after that resistance and emergence stage, people move into what is called introspection. So it's kind of like the dissonance stage where something happens and you sort of start to re-question, or you start to question beliefs that are more firmly held. So like, do I have to be this resistant? Is there a way we can all work together? And I would argue that's where we see T'Challa at the beginning of the film, and I would say throughout the film, he's sort of starting to reconsider, does Wakanda have to sort of stay hidden and stay sort of like to themselves? And then arguably the ideal, and I use that term loosely, the ideal stage of minority identity development is what we call integrative awareness. So it's being able to understand, yes, I'm a minority and that's cool. That doesn't mean throw all the white people away. That doesn't mean like, all white people are trash, or that, we have to be so separate. It's sort of like a synergy. And I would say that that's where we see T'Challa at the end of the film when he goes to address the UN, and he talks about sort of bringing the world together. And so we sort of, like I said, see him move from where we saw him in the throne room, where he's like, no, I'm not the king of all people, to essentially saying this.
My name is King T'Challa, son of King T'Chaka. I am the sovereign ruler of the nation of Wakanda. And for the first time in our history, we will be sharing our knowledge and resources with the outside world. Wakanda will no longer watch from the shadows. We cannot. We must not. We will work to be an example of how we as brothers and sisters on this earth should treat each other. Now more than ever, the illusions of division threaten our very existence. We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us. But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges, while the foolish build barriers. We must find a way to look after one another as if we were one single tribe.
With all due respect, King T'Challa, what can a nation of farmers have to offer the rest of the world?
Yay. Okay. And I'll end by saying this is a shameless plug. I wrote about this very thing in this book that my fellow panelists and I all contributed to. Black Panther Psychology Hidden Kingdom. So if you appreciated this talk and you want to know all the other Black Panther things, you should totally buy this book because it's awesome.
Okay, well, I got a question. I absolutely love the end of that movie, right? And I love this idea of living as one tribe. And I love the idea of the illusion of separateness. And when we bring those two ideas together, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, the necessity of borders. This is not how people often want to talk, but I would argue that if we are going to have one tribe, it's going to have to be committed to a world of sustained difference. In other words, what we share in common is that we are different and we celebrate difference. So there have to then be, what sounds bizarre, borders that are created to sustain difference. We call those laws, and when they are appropriately followed to the extent of what they were meant to, that can work. I just sometimes get concerned that when people say one tribe, it's like we'll be at that end stage and we'll all be together. And I think we're always going to all be together within our own boundaries. And that's, for me, the tension and the challenge. Man, I love it.
And I think that's why Black people in particular that saw the film kind of like aligned with what Killmonger was saying. Kind of like aligned with what Killmonger was saying, because I think that he sort of was like very vocal about, like you just mentioned laws, right? But who made those laws?
Yep.
The people who in power that made those laws didn't make them for people who look like us. And so, I mean, his solution was like, well, let's just throw all of them away and do our own thing.
Yep.
Where, again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but I think that it was easy as a Black person to be like, he's onto something here, you know what I'm saying? And I think it's because that illusion of, being one tribe often means the erasure of Blackness. And it often means, okay, y'all just come over here and sit at the table with us, as opposed to let's create a new table.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, I guess. And so that's why I think it was so beautiful the way that he laid it out in the end of the film. But part of me, the Killmonger part of me, is still just like, it's just because, and I think it's, because of the way in America, the way that, what separateness has meant, it's hard for me to even fathom what does that even look like? Because I've never seen it and I don't know what it would look like,
So I'm, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm Dr. Erik Wesselmann. I'm a social psychologist, and slasher films are a subgenre of the larger genre we would call horror. Horror films have been popular among audiences worldwide pretty much since film has been invented. It's kind of ebbed and flowed, but it's one of those genres that has almost always had some particular releases that would fit within that context. The slasher subgenre emerged in North America in the late 1970s or early 80s, and it's often critically and culturally maligned, which is saying a lot given the horror genre is often critically and culturally maligned. So this is the bottom of the barrel. Even still, it's been wildly popular among youth audiences, and it's made an indelible mark on the American horror market that continues to this day. Why do people like horror? It's important to remember that horror films, like all films, are constructed media products, and they reflect the sociocultural forces that they emerge from. And successful horror creators like Stephen King, for example, and other film scholars who take this sort of culturally embedded perspective argue that the most effective examples in this genre that produce the reactions that they're supposed to find the vulnerable areas of our cultures and attack them with their life-threatening weapon of choice, be it chainsaw, axe, what have you. But they go for those cultural pressure points. So whatever will provoke the most fear and dread in us as an audience, within reason, of course, because we're still meant to enjoy the ride. So let's sit in that for a moment, though. Why would we find experiencing a negative emotion like fear or dread pleasurable? When looking at research on affective science, psychologists who study emotions, they talk about classifying emotions in various different dimensions. And what I have here is one of the more common frameworks. You can look at emotions based upon the type of physiological arousal that they have involved, high versus low. And then you have the sort of valence, if you will, of the experience, being positive or negative. And so if we want to talk about sort of one of the prototypical high arousal and positive emotions, we can talk about excitement, right? Enjoyment, which is very relevant to media studies and looking at audience enjoyment. So you've got, you're breathing really heavy, maybe you're sweating, your heart's beating, right? And it's fun, you like it. Alternatively, on the other side, you have terror, right? So physiological arousal is relatively undifferentiated across the spectrum. The same types of biomarkers you would see when someone is excited, they're having fun, maybe they are attracted to someone romantically. The biomarkers there are very similar to what you see when someone is afraid, right? And so there are other types of things that come in and help us contextualize whether it's positive or negative. When you look at things like horror films, a lot of creators, for example, will talk about them like roller coasters or fun houses, right? And so they'll talk about how this mixture of fear, just a little bit of fear, it's enough to get us going, and then we laugh and we enjoy it. And so where a lot of horror theorists, as well as creators, have talked about sort of that sweet spot is sort of finding that area between terror and excitement and playing with people's expectations, right? Getting them going one way to then, when you flip the switch, make that other feeling then more intense, right? And for example, there's actually some really interesting studies looking at horror films as good date movies, right? You take someone on a date, you're already physiologically attracted to them, you have that scare, you grab them, you look over, and suddenly they look a little more attractive. But the ultimate key out of all of this is that we're doing it we are being scared in a safe space, right? We're in a theater, we're on a roller coaster, hopefully it meets the safety code. We're sort of assuming that, but we're confronting these scares in a way that we know are not real, right? When the lights come up, we get off the ride, we're back to where we were. Through those experiences, though, we've gone through cognitive processes of confronting what scare us. We emerge safely. We also, though, some cultural theorists in this domain have argued, we're thinking about the reality of death, not just for the characters, but also for ourselves and what that might mean. We have to sit in that experience of thinking about our mortality and then come up with a way of reducing whatever negative feelings that has for us. We can come up with ways by saying, well, I wouldn't be stupid like those characters. I wouldn't do that. Or, well, I'm a good person. Maybe I have a particular worldview that I adhere to. And so whenever I do die, something good is waiting for me on the other side. Those are various ways of doing it. But as Stephen King has pointed out in his book, Danse Macabre, when we come through those rituals, we can stop and think, well, okay, at least that's not me. Not yet. I'm still alive. And there are some data to support some of these different assertions. But I want to talk a little bit now about the slasher film in particular as a subgenre. It grew from a general shift that was happening in horror starting about the 60s. Most people point at Psycho as one of sort of the key cultural touchstones, where the threat in horror, the thing that's making us scared, had shifted from external threats, where the monsters came from other countries into the United States, or they came from outer space. It came from outer space. And suddenly those threats were homegrown. And the closer they were to threatening our cherished institutions, they were hiding there, or even in the family unit, the scarier they were. In the late 70s and 80s, most popular horror films chose this approach, so it didn't just stay with slasher, it kind of took over. But what was the specific genre definition for the slasher? Like any academic definition, you find 10 academics and you get 20 definitions. And so what I've done is I've kind of gone through the various different books that I've found, articles, and sort of distilled what I consider to be the common threads among all their definitions. First and foremost, generally speaking, the victims are teenagers. We'll talk about why that might be. Some definitions specify young women, some specify promiscuity of the victims, and sometimes there are intersections there where they focus specifically on promiscuous women. There's also typically a lone survivor, which is often female. So Carol Clover's, sort of coined the term "the final girl" in her work on this genre. There's debates about whether or not those characters have to be pure or virginal, but generally speaking, there's an agreement that there's at least one survivor, and that survivor is usually a woman. And that is made famous in Scream in the mid-90s, this idea of the sin factor, right? So in the context of Scream, there's this moment where the movie buff Randy says there are certain rules you have to abide by to survive a horror film. He doesn't specifically specify slashers. He says horror generally. But a lot of the films that are being referenced in there are what we would call slashers. But don't do drugs, don't drink underage, don't have sex, and never say I'll be right back. All right, that last one's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but this idea of the sin factor is something that has carried forward in popular views of this, as well as critical views. What do actually lay people and audiences think? So I've, for the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've occasionally collected pilot studies in my lab or among my students to kind of get their view. And so I'll ask them, for example, in a horror slasher film, how likely to die is female character versus male character? 1 to 7. 1, not at all. 7, very much so. And I have those two there for the sort of gender binary comparison to test this idea of a slasher being focused mostly on women victims. I also generated some items to get at the sin factor. How likely is a person to die who drinks underage or uses illegal drugs, steals, or has premarital sex? I also, as a comparison, have a person who refrains from immoral behavior, trying to tap that sort of survivor or final girl perspective. And across all of my different samples, I see very similar patterns. Testing the misogyny perception, well, participants are more likely to assume that a female character is going to die than a male, so fitting what sort of the general view is. And then in terms of morality, we see people thinking that sinners are more likely to die than non-sinners. And I see this consistently. So this fits what the sin factor that Randy identifies in Scream. But this is just sort of a perception. Is it actually what the films are showing? Because when you look at arguments that critics make, etc., they say these films are misogynistic. These films are modern morality plays, as opposed to I experience them as such. Subtle difference, but that may be very important, and we'll come into that. So let's talk a little bit about some of these films in terms of what they quote-unquote are based upon what they show, what the writers and actors have said they brought to it. So we'll start there. We'll start with what's often considered to be the prototype of the first slasher cycle, Halloween. So if you look at the kill count in Halloween, there are 5 victims, 3 are women and 2 are men. And actually one of the male victims people don't really recognize because you see the kill happens off screen. It's the person who Michael Myers takes his coveralls from. So you sort of see a body in the bushes, so it's real quick. So most people might miss that. Okay. Just because in this case you have 3 to 2, 1 extra woman, does that make it misogynistic? That means hypothetically then that this film hates women, right? And then presumably the audience who is enjoying it might as well. That's oftentimes what critics sort of assume. Right? And sure, there's probably statistically some misogynists in the audience, but these are very, very popular films that, generally speaking, have both men and women in the audience enjoying them, right? So I don't think that necessarily works for everyone. When you look, for example, at what John Carpenter, the director, and Deborah Hill, the producer and co-writer, when they were talking about creating this film, and horror films in general, the focus is to scare people. right? And so the focus is by and large to get audience members to identify with the victim, certainly the survivor, if not those others who are being menaced by the killer. And so they argued, for example, that they wanted to sort of make these characters as identifiable, as likable as possible to make it as scary as they could. Right. So, and there's data on horror fans that suggest that most horror fans say they are more likely to identify with the survivor than the killer. I argue, thankfully, and that's where their focus is. And actually, a lot of horror fans are actually very high in empathy, for example, and that empathy seems to be connected towards the people who are being menaced because they're more likely to be scared with them. Now, there were critics at the time who read this film, interpreted it within the context of the neoconservative movement in the 70s and the 80s. And so that's where they said, well, these films are just morality plays. They're enforcing traditional conservative moralities. That's why all these characters are drinking and having sex and doing drugs. Well, Carpenter and Hill have gone on record by resoundingly rejecting that, saying that, well, yeah, there's a lot of drugs and sex going on here because the audience are adolescents, and that's what they're doing, right? And so we want these characters to be similar so they identify with them. And if sex is anywhere relevant at all in this film, it's that it's a distraction to many of the characters, right? Because people talk a lot about how Laurie Strode is the virgin, right? And so because she's not having sex, that's why, you know, her virginity is what saves her. Well, they point out, and even in the script, that Laurie Strode, she's not having sex because she doesn't want to. It's a lack of opportunity. They make that very clear at several points, that she is interested in dating someone. It just hasn't happened yet, right? And also, to sort of further stick a needle in the whole sort of sin equals death thing, there is a scene in there where she's smoking a joint with one of her friends. It very specifically says in the script that she is smoking a joint. So I've done some coding, and so have others. I found at least 6 different content coding analyses published. They vary in the types of films that they choose, unfortunately. But when you look at them, out of those 6, only one of them shows a gender difference towards women being more likely to kill than men. All the others either show men being more likely to die than women, or equal opportunity, for lack of a better description. But I've been engaging in my own coding, and if we just look, for example, at the most popular slasher film franchises, right? Halloween, having 7 films. I'm only counting the originals here, not the remakes, and I'm also not counting Halloween 3 because that's very different from the rest. But we've got 7 Halloween films, 10 Friday the 13th, 7 Nightmare on Elm Street, and then we have the grudge match between Freddy versus Jason. If we look at these films and we assume the victim ratios are quote unquote biased against, you know, men or biased against women, depending upon that ratio, we see that, for example, across Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, of all of these films, only 3 of them have more women victims than men. The majority of them have more male victims than women. And 5, I guess if we're taking this sort of anti-view, we can call them misanthropic, right? But by and large, the data do not conform to the critical and popular perception of these films. A couple other examples of selections. Noel had more men than women in terms of this coding. Kurzweil had, of the top 10 slasher films, I put a greater than or equal sign there because Kurzweil's coding has more men than women, but his numbers are off than mine. So I have to go back and rewatch those films that are off. But basically, it's either going to be more men than women by 1 film or equal is what it's going to come down to. So once again, not fitting what the popular conception is. So why? Why is that? Why do people's perceptions of these films, either their memories or maybe even what they're seeing, differ so wildly from what the data in this context are actually showing? And that's what I continue to come back to. Here's my thought, based upon extant theories in psychology. A classic we might call just world belief theory. The idea here that we believe that things happen for a reason, that the good are rewarded and the bad are punished. And there's a classic literature here where people are more likely to victim blame across the board, if for no other reason than to say, hey, it's not me. You know, I wouldn't do this. I would survive this film because I wouldn't do that. A more commonly used modern theory would be called terror management theory, which the idea here, drawing on philosopher Ernest Becker, the idea that thinking about our own death scares the hell out of us. And so that we need to think about any possible way that we won't die, or if we do, that will be rewarded in the end. And I think both of these are perfectly reasonable theoretical frameworks to understand what it's like to think about these films or to remember them afterwards, right? I remember that those kids deserved it, changed my mind. Never mind that the data don't fit that at all. I'm having a bit more trouble with the misogyny one. There aren't really as many good theories to help make sense of this. The only thing I can think of is there were a couple published studies that have coded that showed more men than women dying, but women were shown in terror longer, right? And so those were interpreted as being hatred towards women. But remember, these films, the people who watch these films, at least what they report, is they want to be scared. They're rooting for the survivor. They're not necessarily rooting for the killer. So they're more likely to identify with the people in terror here. So that difference could still be sexist. It just may be benevolent sexism as opposed to hostile misogynistic sexism. Not saying either are good. I'm simply saying that this may be one way that they're remembering those things, or maybe they just want to hate on these films to begin with, right? That's also possible. They're like, well, those are just misogynistic, so I'm going to recall the events that confirm my bias. And we call that motivated recall. And my animations are off. All right, well, at that moment, I will leave the pumpkin to take me out and say thank you, and we can banter.
A couple years ago, I did like an existential analysis of Jason and why, because I think another thing that sort of like we could build on your talk is not only when people identify with the survivor, but when we identify with the slasher. So like Freddy Krueger arguably is like, everybody loves him, and he was like a child rapist. And so it's like, how do we rationalize that in our mind? And even Jason, I think for me, I like Jason because he's just a victim of, he's like a trauma survivor, and he's just like, if y'all just leave him alone, he'll leave you alone. But I think that's also something that's interesting, that I don't know what you've read about in the research, but why fans of horror, particularly fans of slasher films, like more often than not go see them because of the killer, not because of the other people. So it's like, we want to see that killer, and Freddy, you know, he's just like larger than life. So I think that's also interesting.
And I think that identifying with the killer, and there are you could approach that from, so most data suggests that horror fans, if they had to pick, would pick the survivor, right? But that's not to say that there isn't some amount of identification with aspects. If we look at the literature on anti-heroes, for example, and sympathetic villains, we sort of can learn to, there's been some really great research and communication on this, where they look at how people learn to appreciate aspects of the anti-heroes withoat wanting to be them, right? Yes. And, you know, maybe there's some sort of vicarious thrill occasionally, like, you know, maybe there's at least 2 or 3 slasher films that I can think of where there really is just a jerk character that is not meant to be identified with at all. This happens in like some of the later films in particular, where I remember seeing Freddy versus Jason, and one of the characters is a horrible misogynist.
Yep. And
he starts berating his significant other, and like the entire theater went, "Oh, he's next!" Right? So there is, you know, there was some sort of like satisfaction vicariously. You know, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that in real life, I hope. But you know, we also do know that this isn't real, right? Most of us do.
Bravo, let's get up out of here.
We pray at night for the helpless, hoping you get us through.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stanford Carpenter, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific. Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific met for the first time while saving the universe. Black Lightning posed a simple question to Mr. Terrific. So, do you really call yourself Mr. Terrific? Mr. Terrific responded, and you really call yourself Black Lightning? Hey, back when I started in this business, I was the only one of us around. I wanted to make sure everyone knew who they were dealing with. Guess that's why you put your name stitched on the back of your jacket. Well, actually, it's exactly why. It's a generational thing. To look at the world, dream of something better, and make it so, only to have the next generation come along and dream the world anew. Some call it progress, some might call it justice. But when it comes to creating and updating mainstream comic book superheroes, dreaming a better world involves grappling with Black identity and Black empowerment across generational and racial lines. I purchased Black Lightning #1 when I was in grade school. I like the Afro wig because of its association with masculinity and such slogans as Black Power and Black is Beautiful. But living in a mostly white suburb meant that much to do with Black empowerment was considered radical in a very pejorative sense. I also liked that Black Lightning was middle class, had no criminal record, and was nobody's partner or sidekick. I did not like his exposed chest and the overwhelmingly urban locale of his stories, but still, I bought every issue. The means of imagining Black superheroes. As comic book characters, Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific are part of a process in which individual experiences, ideas, and things are a material resource, quite literally the means of imagining a world, that both references and informs their creators' worlds. Comic books are artifacts filled with ideas about the world that are embodied in characters created by creative teams with high turnover rates. As such, the characters and stories are more permanent than creative teams. And as the list of creators, beliefs, ideas, inspirations, and storylines grow, Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific went from being the creation of one to the creation of many. So let's start off with a couple of the players. Tony Isabella, John Ostrander, Judd Winick, and Jeff Johns. It's tempting to look at them in racial terms, 4 white guys. But when asked how they identified themselves, each of them spoke about their ethnicity within an explicitly generational context. Isabella and Ostrander came from when Black characters were underrepresented in popular culture. They sought to right this wrong by creating characters that they could barely imagine. Johns and Winick are part of what Mark Anthony Neal refers to as the post-soul generation, a segment of Generation X that came of age as Black culture was fast becoming a part of popular culture. Tony Isabella created Black Lightning in 1977. Growing up in Cleveland, quote, everybody thought all the Italians were criminals, gangsters, so I never felt like I was in the majority. I never felt particularly white. He grew up relatively oblivious to the civil rights movement and had no African-American friends until he went to comic book conventions. But as a young Italian-American dealing with prejudice and a lack of role models, he understood African-American desires for African-American superheroes. It was about fairness. Judge Winick describes himself as a white guy whose culture is Judaism. The longer I live on the West Coast, the more Jewish I feel. A participant in MTV's Real World San Francisco, Winick became the writer for DC Comics in the late 1990s. During an off-screen conversation about childhood superheroes, Pam Ling, a fellow Real World participant who Winick later married, remarked that as a Chinese-American girl, she did not have a superhero. This single phrase led him to explicitly consider the identities of characters as well as their familial relationships whenever he put pen to paper. Mr. Terrific rose to prominence under television and film writer Jeff Johns. Johns grew up in the Detroit metro area. When asked about his identity, he said he grew up in a Lebanese household. People made fun of his Lebanese name until he changed it. Now he is regarded as a white guy. I interviewed him in 2006. At the time, his wife was African American. He described family gatherings as multicultural affairs, affecting both his outlook on life and work. When he sees an African American or Middle Easterner in a comic, he does not see another. He sees his kin. So let's get back to the story of Black Lightning. In 1976, Tony Isabella was approached by DC Comics to develop a concept that they had purchased titled The Black Bomber, a white racist Vietnam vet who, in times of stress, would turn into a black superhero, according to Isabella. He retained no memory of his actions as the Black Bomber and continued to be a racist when he transformed back into his normal white self. Isabella spoke his mind. The Black Bomber was offensive and a poor choice for DC Comics' first high-profile black superhero with his own comic book. DC responded by commissioning him to create a new black character. Enter Black Lightning, former athlete, teacher by day, and crime fighter at night. He wanted Black Lightning, aka Jefferson Pierce, to be African-American, an accessible and attainable role model, a man who had fallen from grace but still had a sense of law, politics, religiosity, and righteousness. He did not want him to be ultra-powered, motivated by revenge, angry, or to have a criminal past. Two inspirations came together for him. He was thinking of Welcome Back, Kotter, the TV show that ran from 1975 to 1979, which is basically about a teacher who returns to his old neighborhood. And he was thinking of the 1968 Olympics, during which African-American athletes raised their hand in a black power salute. According to Isabella, an editor came up with the idea of attaching an Afro wig to Black Lightning's mask because he and some of the other editors thought it looked cool. Another editor successfully lobbied to have Black Lightning's shirt open to his waist to show that the character was unmistakably black. Isabella liked Black Lightning's Afro because it signaled black power, black pride, and radical politics while maintaining Pierce's short hair and a conservative veneer and a civilian identity. He did not like the open shirt, but at a certain point when you're working in a large group of people, you don't win all the battles. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Terrific. The new Mr. Terrific was created by John Ostrander, actually as part of a Spectre story. He replaced the original Mr. Terrific, a white male superhero who was created in 1942 and murdered years later in a Justice League story. The new Mr. Terrific joined the Justice Society of America in 1999 and was elected its chairman and became the co-director commonly referred to as the White King of the DC Universe-inspired spy agency called Checkmate. Both Mr. Terrifics are motivated by a desire to be role models. The original Mr. Terrific was a socially conscious member of the idle rich. The new Mr. Terrific is a former Olympic athlete and recognized corporate leader with a genius-level intellect. He's haunted by the tragic death of his wife, and in spite of the wonders that he has seen, questions the existence of God. What's interesting is seeing the different iterations of Black Lightning, and I want to focus a little bit on Black Lightning and Green Arrow. Judd Winnick used Black Lightning in a series of stories that he wrote for two different comic books, Green Arrow and The Outsiders. The first was a multi-issue Green Arrow storyline about a fictitious corporation, Everlast, involved in the displacement of Star City's poor in order to make way for new development. Everlast work sites are under siege by a combination of former residents and big scary monsters. Black Lightning initially appears as Jefferson Pierce, Secretary of Education under President Luther, a job that he accepted in order to keep tabs on Superman's arch nemesis. After their initial encounter, Black Lightning and Green Arrow meet for drinks. Pierce reveals that his daughter Anissa has superpowers. He does not want her to become a superhero and has convinced her to finish college first. The conversation is interrupted by the arrival of Jefferson Pierce's niece, Joanna Pierce. Over the course of the next 5 issues, Oliver Queen becomes romantically involved with Joanna Pierce, and as Green Arrow takes on the cause of the residents. Everlast hires a paid assassin to go after anyone associated with Green Arrow, and Green Arrow brings down the Everlast Corporation, but not before Joanna Pierce is killed. Jefferson Pierce encounters Oliver Queen in a hospital waiting room. In the background, a television news anchor reports the mysterious death of the CEO of Everlast, the result of being struck by lightning. Oliver Queen tries to apologize to Jefferson Pierce for his niece's death. Jefferson Pierce replies, "What do you have to be sorry for? I introduced her to you. I should have kept her out of this life. she was family. We're supposed to protect family. The next time we see Black Lightning is in the pages of the revamped Outsiders, also written by Judd Winnick. Jefferson Pierce's daughter, Thunder, is a member of the team. Still reeling from the death of Joanna Pierce, Black Lightning tries to convince Thunder to quit the Outsiders. As is the case in many comics, Black Lightning is pressed into service. And much to Black Lightning's chagrin, Thunder is so impressed with her father's skill in battle that she then redoubles her efforts to become a better superhero. Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific stories are the embodiment of beliefs, ideas, and inspirations of creators of different backgrounds and generations. Their comic book narratives emphasize faith, family, and generational change in ways that reflect the creators' lives. Black Lightning started as the DCU African-American superhero, and his adventures focused on him being African-American. As he became one of the few DCU African-American superheroes, in part due to the creation of such characters as Mr. Terrific, Black Lightning's adventures came to emphasize his African-American perspective. For example, as an African-American superhero who sires another African-American superhero, he puts family and legacy into an African-American context. Mr. Terrific begins as a not-so-pale imitation of a second-rate character. He is reintroduced to counter a racial offense and eventually emerges as the DCU post-racial Black superhero. This meeting is significant because, according to Infinite Crisis writer Jeff Johns, the meeting between Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific is significant because they are high-profile African-American DCU superheroes. They have similar motivations and have faced criticisms over their costumes and names, but still represent African-American perspectives. Johns intentionally used their interactions to affirm Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific's mutual sense of Black pride, as well as their awareness of their respective positions in the DCU. And so what's interesting is ultimately you have this tension between, the black superhero in Black Lightning and the superhero who happens to be Black in Mr. Terrific. What's really interesting is that as the characters develop, Black Lightning is really a much more conservative character, right? He's got strong religious views, and there's a real emphasis on family. Like, his marriage doesn't work out. He's divorced from his wife, but he's still very involved in his children's lives, both of whom have powers and are becoming superheroes, right? Mr. Terrific is coming from the opposite perspective. He actually functions in the mourning of the loss of potential family, right? He starts with the death of his wife and contemplating suicide, and instead he decides, I'm gonna become Mr. Terrific, right? Both these characters move out of the comics, and that's where it becomes equally as interesting. They're both a part of the Arrowverse, right? Mr. Terrific is actually introduced first. He's introduced as one of the characters in the Arrow series that features Green Arrow. Now, his character is a much bigger departure in that he's introduced as Curtis Holt, which is a slightly different name, and he's introduced out the box as being a tech genius and a former Olympic athlete, and he's gay, and he actually shows up with his husband, right? But he's also very much in keeping with the character in that he's very much the superhero who happens to be Black. He comes up with the idea of being Mr. Terrific, inspired not by a previous superhero, but a pro wrestler in the Green Arrow universe. And again, you see this mourning for the loss of family in that in his storyline, once his husband finds out that he's a vigilante, his husband files for divorce, and you just see the utter elimination of his family as he's becoming a part of sort of the Green Arrow family, right? Black Lightning is a little more, I wouldn't say more interesting, but he's given more time to be interesting in that he headlines his own series. And what they do is they actually take the character from the comics and they deal with him as a character who's coming out of retirement. So they keep a lot of what happened in the Black Lightning comic by saying, well, that was back in the past. He's like this guy who he was a superhero. Black Lightning was out there and then he disappeared and nobody knows why. And what we find out is that Jefferson Pierce is a high school principal at a magnet school that emphasizes the development of young kids of color. His older daughter is a recent graduate. His younger daughter is there at the school, and he comes out of, and he is divorced. And the reason he's divorced is because being Black Lightning destroyed his marriage, you know. And he's still always trying. He's trying to get his wife back, his family back, right? And so long story short, his younger daughter gets into trouble. She gets kidnapped. He comes out of retirement, and that's when Black Lightning comes back. And within the first season, both of his daughters have power, you know, emerge to also have powers. And again, you have this push-pull where he's like, you know, I was Black Lightning so that you wouldn't have to be a part of this life. And they're like, not so much. We want it. This is the life we want, right? Mm-hmm. And what's also interesting is you have this tension between different ideas that parallels different ideas about civil rights, right? You know, Jefferson Pierce is very much a you know, we've got to be better. We've got to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and he's pushing that forth in the school, and he's doing it in a very interesting way. Whereas his daughters are kind of like, no, we got to fight, and we got power, we can use it. And then the other thing that's also interesting is that they flesh out is that his older daughter is a lesbian, and they actually have her come out within the context of the show. But what's interesting is she comes out, and it's not the stressful event that you would usually expect, and that's actually an interesting element of the Arrowverse is the way in which they treat homosexuality, right? You know, within the characters. But instead of spending a lot of time talking about it, I'd like to just leave a little more time for us to discuss what's happening with these characters. And for me, I'm just particularly interested in what happens when these characters are created and they go through these processes, because I've always said that the thing that interests me most about comics is that oftentimes, you know, a character that's offensive today can be transcendent tomorrow. And I feel that we see that in some very interesting ways, especially with Black Lightning and Mr. Terrific's characters as they develop over time.
But where I see the generational piece more so between Mr. Terrific and Black Lightning is where you just described Stanford between his daughters and him, and how, you know, I love that quote you just said. I am Black Lightning, so you don't have to be. And they're like, what? No, we're here and we're ready. And to me, that's such a parallel to what's happening now with social justice. And, you know, Gen Z is in it, and millennials, we are in it, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that it's sad that we have to continue to fight the same fight that like my grandparents were fighting, but also like, what's up? I'm here. Mm-hmm. And I think that is such a beautiful like manifestation, and sort of like so it's such a beautiful parallel to what's going on right now. And Black Lightning was like what you're describing. Season 1 was like how many years ago? So it's like not even, it's just so beautiful how it's all coming together.
What's interesting also in the television show is that the older daughter takes on a third identity.
Yes.
In order to do basically to do social justice work, right? So she takes on this third superhero identity, so that she's not she's less beholden to her dad, and she's much more brutal, and she's just going out and kicking butt, taking names, and to some degree, like in some instances, basically stealing from the rich to give to the poor, right? Like she is just like, and it's really interesting to see that. The other thing I'm interested in, and I don't know if and I think it's also something that we don't talk enough about, is the presence of family. Right. If you look in a lot of comics, Black superheroes don't have families, and these superheroes very much have families, and a lot of this is contextualized within family, right? And within this idea that, like, you know, and when you think about when you think about the stereotypes of Black life, right? A lot of it is about, you know, where are the dads, you know, which is also a way of saying that they don't have family.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What I really liked about your comment of the daughter taking on 3 identities, it's a pretty stark example of different levels of necessity. And when you have characters that have only 2 identities, their superhero identity and their normal identity, it's easy for that to collapse in good, right and wrong, good and evil. Now you have a character who has 3 identities because necessity exists at all these different levels, and it then problematizes this notion of right and wrong, which superhero genre is always sort of possible to collapse into. So I have to admit I haven't seen the character, but now I have to, because it kind of makes the case for wild histories, right? It makes the case for multiple levels of necessity, and if I can find a different way to handle that there and that there and that there, and I'm gonna, right?
And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier too, Scott, about code switching, because I think that for people of color, specifically for Black people, and I can speak from my own experience, I'm sure you can too, Stanford, like having multiple identities is a means of survival. It's not because I want to, it's because professional me can't be personal me or I won't have a job. You know what I'm saying? And so I don't know how it was presented in the show with this character that you're describing, but I think that that's something that I think is often too, like maybe not explored as much of the, like you said, necessity. Like code switching is survival. It's necessary for people of color, as opposed to like, I'm just doing this because it's fun. You know what I'm saying? Like I can't always authentically be myself because that's not safe, you know?
Right.
Well, it's also interesting because in the series Black Lightning, you know, when he becomes Black Lightning, he does things that Jefferson Pierce, the high school principal, would tell his kids not to do.
Yeah.
You know, so so yeah, when we start talking about like what does, you know, and I think that also makes us really start to ask questions about, well, what does becoming a superhero, what does it allow you to do by having these multiple identities, by being able to code switch, by being able to, it's not just about being able to move in spaces you normally wouldn't move. It's not just about protecting your family, especially in his case, because like his family doesn't need protecting, because he's probably the least powerful in the group. You know, but it is about doing things that you otherwise would have trouble doing.